So last week we were talking about inheritance and debt, and I was going to talk about a lot of that today. And I was going over some of the laws about inheritance again. And I started in when I started writing the sermon, I started in Numbers 27. And Numbers 27, verse 8, is probably one of the most, it's referenced quite a little bit in any Bible discussion that you see in inheritance. It's always going to Numbers 28, or 27, verse 8. And thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel, saying, If a man die and have no son, then ye shall cause his inheritance to pass unto his daughter. If he have no daughter, then he shall give his inheritance unto his brother. Now we read these last week. Verse 10, And if he have no brethren, then he shall give his inheritance unto his father's brother. And if his father have no brethren, then he shall give his inheritance unto his kinsman, and his next of him, and his family, and he shall possess it. And it shall go unto the children of Israel statute of judgment, as the Lord commanded Moses. So see, here we're talking about this law makes it clear that inheritance means succession. And this was, of course, we read about how the tribes were to keep their wealth within the tribes. So it's all about preserving the wealth of the tribe, and eventually if you talk about the land and the wealth that that tribe had, it would eventually lead to the tribe securing its own power. So it was a case of checks and balances, really. And then if you go to Deuteronomy 21, which we read last week, I'll read this very quickly. This one was about the son of when a man had multiple wives. Deuteronomy 21, verse 16, Then it shall be, when he make the sons to inherit all that he hath, that he may not make the son of the beloved firstborn before the son of the hated, which is indeed the firstborn, but he shall acknowledge the son of the hated for the firstborn, by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the beginning of his strength, and the right of the firstborn is his. And we read that last week. So in terms of inheritance, the firstborn actually prevailed as the largest shareholder, receiving a double portion of the estate, and in assuming the estate, the firstborn son also assumed a double portion of the estate's debt as well. And that outstanding debt went to the firstborn. And the firstborn, of course, had the job of taking care of the aged parents as well. That was part of being the firstborn. That was part of the inheritance. And the debts that the estate accrued, which would have been anywhere from land debt, there are some debts in the Bible as outlined to a servant or to bills that you couldn't pay. Assuming the estate meant that the firstborn assumed whatever debts the estate had accrued. And those, of course, were forgiven at the year of Jubilee, which we'll talk more of later. But it wasn't a case where they had mortgages on the land or anything like that we have today. So don't think it was the firstborn doesn't inherit his mother or father's credit card debt. It wasn't like that. There were different kinds of debts back then. Now, we also read last week also that succession cannot be denied to a godly firstborn son. Now, an ungodly child, like we said last week, was cut off, and biblically this term is used to repeatedly cover the laws of excommunication, disinheritance, and capital punishment. Remember, we read about the rebellious juvenile delinquent. And succession, so the Bible outlines that succession as inheritance is a godly succession. You see, not only was it about keeping the tribe's wealth within the tribe, but it was also about maintaining the religion of the Israelites as the firstborn. Now, we did talk about debt, and that's what I wanted to cover today. I'd like to see what the Bible says about debt. So debt, very simply, in layman's terms, is something that is owed or something that is due. Typically, when we talk about debt, we're talking about money. Now, notice I did not qualify debt here as good or bad. And you notice I didn't append any morality to it. It's just debt. So debt is simply a condition then. Being in debt is owing someone something with the expectation that it will be paid back sometime in the future. That's all debt is. Now, when you choose to ascribe morality to debt or a debt situation, then you're really forming an opinion about either why the debt was created or the characters of the people or persons involved in the debt situation. Now, don't misunderstand me. In this nation, debt is a severe problem. And the majority of individuals that live here in this country, it's actually a way of life. And its consequences tend to be anywhere from mild to severe. So yes, debt is a problem. But most Christians are taught to view debt through the lens of morality And some pastors even go so far as to say that being in debt is a result of you being in sin, or if you have debt, that's the result of you being in disobedience of God, to God and His laws. And I've actually seen churches that would actually restrict fellowship or membership to people that get into debt. There's the only situation where I ever saw that debt affected someone like that was in the military. When you held a security clearance, when you got too far into debt, you started to get paperwork put on you because the military assumed that you would be an easy target for bribes then. That was about the only thing I ever saw when it came to debt being a very severe punishment to someone, but that was the military. Now, I'm going to focus on the facts then about what it is the Bible says about debt and get this straight. Now, the Bible doesn't say that debt is a sin. The Bible doesn't say it's the result of disobedience. People assume it does because they've been erroneously taught that from today's churches. We'll go to 2 Kings. And we read this a couple of weeks ago in our Bible study. 2 Kings chapter 4. I'll start at verse 1. Now there cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets unto Elisha, saying, Thy servant my husband is dead, and thou knowest that thy servant did fear the Lord. And the creditor is come to take him unto the two sons to be bondsmen. And Elijah said unto her, What shall I do for thee? Tell me, what hast thou done in the house? And she said, Thy handmaid has not done anything in the house save a pot, has not anything in the house save a pot of oil. Then he said, Go borrow thee vessels abroad of all thy neighbors, even empty vessels, borrow not a few. And when thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thee and thy sons, and thou shalt pour out all these vessels, and thou shalt set aside that which is full. So she went from him and shut the door upon her and upon her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said to her son, Bring me yet a vessel. And he said unto her, There is not a vessel more, and the oil stayed. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, Go sell the oil, pay thy debt, and live thou and thy children in rest. And you know, this is one of the miracles of Elijah, the prophet. So see, when you ascribe morality to debt then you would be wrong in the situation here. There's many reasons people get into debt, sometimes of their own choosing, and then sometimes, in a case here in 2 Kings, in circumstances that are beyond their control. You see, so the widow here found herself in debt and at risk of losing her sons because her husband had passed away and she couldn't satisfy her creditors, you see. So there's no reason to judge her as being in sin or disobedient to God's laws at all. She was just in debt, that's all. And notice in verse 7 that she did sell the oil and she paid the debts. So keep that in mind. She did pay those debts. She didn't have them written off. We go to Deuteronomy 15. Go back to Deuteronomy now. And here's the important thing. Deuteronomy 15, verse 1, And at the end of every 7 years thou shalt make a release. So here's the law of Jubilee. And this is the manner of that release. Every creditor that lendeth ought unto his neighbor shall release it, and he shall not exact it of his neighbor or of his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. Of a foreigner thou mayest exact it again, but that which is thine with thy brothers thine hand shall release, save when there shall be no poor among you, for the Lord shall greatly bless thee in the land which the Lord thy God has given thee for an inheritance to possess it. Only if thou carefully hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all these commandments which I command thee this day, for the Lord thy God blesseth thee as he promised thee, and thou shalt lend unto many nations, but thou shalt not borrow, and thou shalt reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over thee. If there be any among you a poor man of one of thy brethren within any of thy gates in thy land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not harden thine heart, nor shut thine hand from thy poor brother. So these verses implicate, of course, commandment number 4, which is Sabbath. Now, Sabbath in the Bible is rest, forgiveness, and in this case, cancellation of debt. That's the Sabbath law. That's what it governs. Now, you see here, a debt-free and a poverty-free society is viable, I see, in terms of God's law, should it be followed, according to what we just read here in Deuteronomy. Now, I'm not going to be discussing usury or interest to a large degree this morning. Because if you get into interest, then you have to understand the differences as the Bible lays out between an interest-free loan and commercial loans. And there are two very different things according to the Bible. However, all loans, just so we know, all loans are subject to the Sabbath laws, which means on the seventh year they are released. One such restriction the Sabbath law puts upon the loans then is the length. The loan's life is limited to 6 years. So according to the Bible, short-term loans are permitted, you see. As godly Christians, then, we don't have the right to mortgage our futures, you see. Our lives belong to God. That's why short-term loans are permissible. Now, when you mortgage your future over a long length, then your life belongs to other men, you see. And this is what the Bible's protecting us from. And as believers, every kind of debt must be short-term debt. And there's also charity. You'll see the charity's involved here as well. So the Sabbath is for rest rather than worship. And basic to the concept of debt-free living is the Sabbath law. You see, and we're going to cover more of that later. So here, according to what God has set up for us, the lives of His covenant people are to be debt-free, and we're to owe no man anything. Now, if you read Romans 13, you'll see that we are under the obligation of rendering a tribute, honor, fear, and custom, whenever due, and of rendering love, which is the fulfilling of law. So that is something that's obligatory to covenant people, but we're to owe no man anything. Now, according to what we've read, if God's law was followed in regards to the financial laws and Sabbath, there would be no poor among us. You see, God has a way for debt-free living, and you understand this implies what the economics of the kingdom will be. Several of us have read what happened in Acts. We believe also the bartering system will kick in as well. Remember, right after the Pentecost, that's how it happened. Now, if you look here, the unbeliever then are excluded from the laws of Sabbath. They're excluded, unbelievers. Concerning charity, unbelievers are excluded from that. Interest-free loans and the termination of debt. Now, that's the stranger. That's unbelievers. And we're going to cover that in future sermons as well, because if you understand that the person who is not under the law is not a free man, then that means that the person who is not under the law is a slave, which means then there is no release from that slavery because Sabbath laws do not apply to them. So it gets very complex, which means there is no forgiveness of debt, and there is a case of usury allowed to be used on the non-believer. And also, of course, charity. You see, we don't give to them, give to our believers. And the Bible does make that a distinction. We'll get into that. It's complex stuff. But anyway, according to what we're reading here in Deuteronomy 15, upon the seventh year, debt is to be released. That's what we need to take with us from that. And we'll go to Psalm very quickly. We'll look at something else. Go to the 37th Psalm and look at verse 21. I didn't have that marked. I just turned right to it. So I'm going to go ahead and read it. Psalm 37, verse 21. The wicked borroweth and payeth not again, but the righteous showeth mercy and giveth. Ecclesiastes 5:5, I'll read very quickly. Better is it that thou should not vow a vow, that thou should vow, better is it that thou shouldest not vow, than thou shouldest vow and not pay. Okay? You see where we're going here. More wisdom of Solomon, Proverbs 11. Proverbs 11:15 I read, He that is surety for a stranger shall smart for it, and he that hateth suretyship is sure. Now he's talking about sureties. Proverbs 22:26. It's a handful of verses in the Bible that talks about debt. 22:26 in Proverbs, I'll tie these all together here in a moment. 22:26 states, Be not thou one of them that strike hands, or of them that are sureties for debts. That striking hands is shaking hands. Okay, so what is it that Solomon is warning us against? Do not become a guarantor or a co-signer of another person's loan. That's what he's talking about. No co-signing on loans. Why? Because as Christians, when a loan commit, as Christians, When a loan commitment has been made, we are expected to follow through and be responsible and accountable. Otherwise, we are at the court's mercy. And here, God's justice is always served under his law. You see, and God tells us then to consider our actions, obligations, and personal responsibilities. And God has a lot to say about financial prosperity and how we go about doing it. The Bible's central message regarding debt is that it should be released, paid, or forgiven. That's usually what you're going to find about debt when you read it in the Bible. Now, according to Romans 4, wages are like a debt, and they are to be paid. And of course, we know that when you withhold someone's wages, that's a case law for theft, because you're taking that person's ability to spend money that is due to them away from them. You've actually stolen from that person when you do not pay wages. And it says employers are to treat wages like a debt that you pay immediately as you go. Now, the Bible doesn't always refer to debt as strictly financial. And it's very interesting because if you get into imputation, when you get into balancing of debts, reconciliation, in the old school days, you would reconcile your checkbook, right? Then you get into the financial terms of what it is that God did for us on the cross. It's a fascinating study, and we'll get into that one of these days as well. But the Bible, when it talks about debt, it really doesn't have much to say about it, what it is, and where it comes from. Really what it focuses on is our Christian response to it. That's what the Bible focuses most on. And you see the other two verses that we read, for the most part, they all govern our response to it. We only read two here from Solomon that says to avoid it. If you can, avoid it. Do not become a co-signer for, or don't shake hands or agree to something. And there are about 20 or so verses that I read over this week that concern debt. And there's really just a handful of them in the Bible. And I'd say about 90% of those verses that we've read, a few this morning, they are all about how as Christians should respond to debt. And I estimate about 10% of it is 10% of the verses in the Bible are about actually avoiding it. But I'm not saying debt is something we should all go out and do or engage in, but it's not something that the Bible absolutely condemns either, you see. And I've heard a lot of people put a bad name on debt because they think it's right or wrong. And the Bible doesn't have anything to say that. We need to inspect our theology. That making a moral issue out of debt is not a biblical matter. That's what I'm saying. And pastors all over the nation do it every day. I've seen and heard it. To clear up debt then to Christians, I feel like it's necessary that we need to understand an action that precedes debt. And that's the concept of borrowing. You see, now the Bible has a lot to say about borrowing. Look at Exodus 22, verse 14. And if a man borrow aught of his neighbor, and it be hurt or die, the owner thereof being not with it, he shall surely make it good. Now, this is one of many verses in Exodus that concerns borrowing. And actually, you'd be amazed by the simplicity and effectiveness of God's laws when it does come from borrowing from your neighbor. In the Bible, there was really no such thing as limited liability. There really isn't. There's no act of God clause that gets you out of this. And it really does. If you go through and you read Exodus 22 in the laws, you really see that God drives the point home that us Israelites are to be accountable for everything that we do. And he expects us to think ahead. And one of those things that he expects us to do is a matter of sureties, which we'll talk about sureties here in a minute. And we read Psalms 37 about when we read the avoiding the surety, the co-signing. So here, if you borrow it and something happens to it, you're responsible. This will be the law of restitution will kick in as well. And then, of course, in Psalms we read that, you don't co-sign or anything like that. So, and it says here in Psalms 37, is what we read is the wicked borrow, but they don't pay back, right? So the Bible's clear that when something is borrowed, it should be paid back. According to what we read in Psalms, a person reveals a wicked heart when they refuse to repay anything owed. That's what we read. So it's wickedness. God expects us to consider our ability to repay before we borrow. That's what these laws are about. And it's not popular preaching nowadays because of that scapegoat mentality Christian Israelites have always been guilty of. And this is one of the cases, and that's limited liability. Now, borrowing without a sure way to pay, that's a surety. Borrowing without that violates another principle that the Bible outlines, and that is the principles of surety. And I'll get to that in a moment. In Deuteronomy 15:6, we did read that if you are faithful in obeying God's commandments, you will be blessed and able to lend and not borrow. You see, that's one of the things God promises us. Now look at Deuteronomy 28. Deuteronomy 28, verse 9. Keep therefore the words of this covenant and do them, that you may prosper in all that ye do. You stand this day, all of you, before the Lord your God, your captains of your tribes, your elders and your officers, with all the men of Israel. I'm sorry, that's Deuteronomy 29. Deuteronomy 28, verse 9. The Lord shall establish thee a holy people unto himself, as he has sworn unto thee, if thou shalt keep the commandments of the Lord God, and walk in his ways. Notice what promised us, should we obey his commandments. Verse 10, and all the people of the earth shall see that thou art called by my name of the Lord, and they shall be afraid of thee, and the Lord shall make thee plenteous in goods, in the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy cattle, and the fruit of thy ground, and the land which thy God sware unto thy fathers to give thee. The Lord shall open unto thee his good treasure, the heaven, to give the rain unto the land, and to bless all the work of thine hand, and thou shalt lend unto many nations, and thou shalt not borrow. This is a blessing God promises us. So according again to Deuteronomy, faithfully obeying God's commandments results in blessings, one of which is our ability to lend and not borrow. Biblically, lending was never and is never about increasing profit. It's about being generous to those in need, and as Christians, that's the way we're to be. You see, there is no such thing when it comes to lending between fellow believers as making money on that loan. There's no such thing. The Bible, it's actually categorized as theft, outright theft. It's usury. And as we saw at the widow when we read about in 2 Kings, sometimes borrowing is necessary then. That's okay. However, the Bible seems to suggest that borrowing should be limited to things that you need. Things that you need. Now this is very interesting because I was caught up in this for a long while back when my wife and I were looking at purchasing a home. And actually from our own answering service from America's Promise, this is volume number 1, issue number 1, the answering service. This came from November 1st, 1979. And question number 6 was asked to Sheldon Emery, and this is his response. So, the only way I can purchase a house is to borrow the money from the bankers at interest. Is it wrong to do so? And this is Sheldon Emery's answer. It is seldom actually a good thing to borrow, even when no interest is involved. However, there are many times when we are faced with two options, neither of which is ideal, so we must decide which one is best. This is where your conscience is very important. It is scripturally important that you provide for your family. And he references 1 Timothy 5:8. I would suggest that as long as you do not attempt to provide a 26-room mansion for your family, that such debt is justifiable. Be prudent and be practical. You see? The law itself does not forbid payment of usury. It merely considers it to be slavery. The law only forbids the charging of interest when you loan money to others. In other words, don't put your brother into slavery like Babylon has done to us. You see, that's what interest does. The fact is that now we are in Babylon as a nation, whether we like it or not. Under this system, it's almost impossible to do what is ideally right. We can only do our best, pray that God will remove this yoke from off our necks, and thank God that our justification is based upon the perfect righteousness of Christ and not upon our own ability to obey the law. This guy nails it. Of course, God has led Pastor Emery in such a way that he does not put America's Promise into debt and then takes God's tithe money and pay it out as usury. He also has not fallen into the deceitful trap of overextending the ministry and then having to go into debt to pay for it, expecting God to bail us out. Such a misuse of funds is usually called faith and is the standard practices of faith ministries. We have a different name for it. And of course, that's America's Promise stance, and that is still our stance to this day. And I've talked finances over with Martha, and her and I both agree. You do something, but you do not put yourself into debt over it. And as we saw here, there is no evil thing about being in debt. However, if you can do it, be practical, be prudent, and only for what you need. There's no problem for that widow to borrow what she needed to pay off the creditors. You see, she was not condemned for that. As a matter of fact, it's outlined as a miracle in the Bible, being able to pay off creditors. So, Proverbs 22:7, which I'll read very quickly. I think I already did that one. Let me reference it again. Proverbs 22:7. Solomon, as rich as he was, he had a lot of wisdom concerning money. Proverbs 22:7. Oh, no, we didn't. Proverbs 22:7. The rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. That's a very famous verse. We know that. Borrowing in and of itself is not inherently evil. However, it does lead to obligations and a certain amount of lost freedom. That's what Solomon just said. So be careful. And then, of course, we read the book of James. He states that we as Christians are to what? Have our yes be yes and our no be no. So don't become a co-signer and then try to weasel your way out of it because you said yes, you follow through. Again, consider your actions and you will be held responsible and accountable for those things. That's what a good parent does to his children. Bad parents don't follow through, and God follows through, and he expects us to do the same thing, especially when it comes to borrowing, making pledges, making vows, and oaths. All these things are put into the same thing as, yes, I will repay, should I borrow. But that's making a pledge, vow, and oath. It's very interesting because you can't pledge something that would have someone make a living for themselves. Very interesting case laws on that, vow making. And then, of course, the Bible does not honor, it actually condemns deliberately running up a debt without a way to pay it. You see, now that's the surety. That violates the principles of sureties. And without a surety, not being able to pay it becomes a theft. It becomes deception. In the modern age, we call that fraud. Okay, like fraud would be sitting at a restaurant and ordering a meal without having the means to pay for it and then running out. That's fraud, not theft, because you gave the likeness that you were able to make good on it. That's fraud. It's financial terms are very interesting that way. As a matter of fact, when my mother had come down with cancer, she was told that since she has cancer, just let the bills go and they'll take care of themselves. No need to pay it all off. And my mother said, no, that's theft. Yes, the credit card, but I have the credit cards. I did this. What I bought those things for I needed, they're still in my house. I owe that money. So she made good on it, even if it was $5 a month, even if it was $30 a month. She made good on it because she knew that's the Christian principle of borrowing. Now, in this age, you can go bankrupt, and the Bible does have law about bankruptcy, believe it or not. But you can just be released of all debts. So that's not the Christian thing. And as far as I know, my mother never suffered one bit for doing it the Christian way. She paid them all off, 100%. She has a good name for it too, which is worth its weight in gold. My grandma always used to say, good credit is better than money in the bank because they've got all the money. So being in a form of bondage or debt also impedes then our abilities to further the kingdom. There's too many people that are so far up in debt they can't see the light of day, and that bondage puts them in a place where they cannot work the way they want to work for God. Or they'll say, oh, well, I'm going to get to such and so point, and then I'll do the kingdom work. I just need to pay off these debts, and then I'll get around to doing what it is God told me. And remember, we talk about mortgaging your future. That's what it becomes. That's what it starts to look at like. So, when you're preoccupied with debt, you can't further the kingdom because you're in a form of slavery. God doesn't wish that for us. Look at James 4. This will be the last one we cover this morning. James 4, verse 13. Go now, ye that say, today or tomorrow we'll go into such a city and continue there and a year and buy and sell and get gain, whereas you know not for what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanishes away. For that ye ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. But now ye rejoice in your boastings. All such rejoicing is evil. Therefore, to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is a sin. Awfully condemning language to people that actually know the law, is it not? Of course, if you look at the first couple verses of James, you'll understand who that book's written to. But James here is warning us not to make plans to prosper while ignoring God's will and purpose for us. You see? Pursuing our own will is often the sole reason most people's debt is accrued. Seek to increase your wealth and dependence on God, then. Do not presume the future by way of mortgage in the form of frivolous debt. And if you do that, then according to James, it was boastful, arrogant, and evil. God knows what we need, and he's promised to provide that for us. The problem comes when we choose to define our needs by our standards, and we reject God's provision for not being enough. Then we do whatever it takes to get what we want, even if it involves unwise financial contracts, which we as Christians must honor. We must do that. So here's the truth that I've come to when it comes to, and I've done it the wrong way myself, and I've learned hard lessons when it comes to co-signing and borrowing and lending. Learned hard lessons because not every Christian has the principles and morals we do. The banks certainly don't. So, here's the truth. Sometimes God's way of providing what we need the most is to deny us what we want the most. And that's a hard lesson to learn for a lot of young people because what they want now. And they'll get locked into very unwise financial contracts, and that's what it is. And they'll end up upside down on something they had to have. And when that happens, what was that? College debt's a big one. College is the biggest racket going, if you guys didn't know. It's the biggest scam we have is college debt. Now, I know mine's a terrible thing to waste, but yes, short-term debt, a short-term reward for a long-term mortgaged future. And like we read with Sheldon Emery from the 1979 issue, we live in an age that Babylon is indeed here, and we are in bondage to Babylon. But when you take out a loan, it must be something that you need, not something that you want. Be practical and prudent as Christians. Because when we enter into contracts, we have to honor them. God expects us to do that. That's all I have for the day.